Perfect. Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome to this community meeting for Grove Street. I think this is the fourth one that we have had, and I appreciate everyone sticking with us for this process. My name is Matt Johnson, and I'm the project manager. Before I get into more introductions, I just want to quickly go through some housekeeping items, and then we'll get into the presentation. If you've been involved in this project in the past, you've probably seen some of these slides, but I just want to make sure that everyone is familiar. The first thing to note is that this meeting is being recorded. So if you are to turn your camera on or if you speak, your likeness and your voice will be recorded, so just be aware of that. We will post a recording of this meeting to our website within a couple of days of the meeting. So if you'd like to watch it later, or if you have friends or neighbors who are not able to attend, you can share the video with them after we get it posted. You are all muted, so you do not have the ability to unmute yourself. We can unmute you during the question and answer period of the meeting, and we can do that when you raise your hand. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but basically, if you need to unmute yourself and you've dialed in by telephone, you can dial *6. If you are using a computer, there is a button to unmute yourself once we permit that. So you will still probably have to click OK to unmute once we ask if you want to unmute yourself. We are asking everyone to keep their videos off as a way to conserve bandwidth so that everyone is able to participate in this meeting. So please do keep your video cameras off. And then finally, if you have any questions during the presentation, or if you do not feel comfortable asking your question or making your comment during the question and answer period, you can send those through the chat window, and I would ask you to send those to Dave Merrihew. He is with Stantec. He's one of our consultants, and he'll be handling questions. I'm going to ask you not to send chats to me because I'm not going to be monitoring the chat window while I'm running the presentation. So if you send a chat to me, I won't see it until after the meeting. But if you have a question, send those to Dave, and he will get to you. The way you send a chat is there is a button. It's probably at the bottom of your screen, but it varies depending on what kind of, which version of Zoom you have and what kind of device you're using. But find the chat window, and then at the bottom there's a drop-down box that where you can select who you want to send it to, and just select Dave Merrihew. He should be one of the only people you have an option to send it to, since you can only chat to hosts and co-hosts. All right, with that, let me introduce myself. My name is Matt Johnson. I'm a capital project manager with the Montgomery County Department of Transportation. I'm sure that most of you have seen me at one of these meetings in the past, or in other events at Montgomery County. And I appreciate those of you who have been involved with this since the beginning. But even if it's your first meeting, welcome. We're glad that you're involved. If you have any questions or comments, you can always reach out to me. My contact information is on the screen. And I really do appreciate all the feedback that you give me, whether it's through this official process or if it's outside of the time when we're having meetings, that's appreciated as well. We're gonna quickly get into the presentation here in just a minute. Following that, we'll have time for public comment. We are scheduled to be here until 8:30, but I don't expect that we'll need all that time. We don't have to fill it, so we can adjourn early if we finish all the public comment, but we certainly want to give everyone an opportunity to speak who wants to speak. So we appreciate that. The goals of the meeting tonight are to talk about the results of the traffic analysis that we just completed for stage 1 of the pilot, which is what's currently in place. We also want to get your feedback about the potential options for stage 2 and going forward with this project. So that's kind of the purpose of the meeting. And I'm going to get into the background a little bit first. I think everyone's probably familiar with Grove Street if you're in this meeting, but it is a residential street. It's about 4 blocks long. It runs from Sligo Avenue up to Bonifant Street on the edge of downtown Silver Spring. And our project area covers the entire length of Grove Street. There are some pictures of Grove Street before stage 1 treatments were implemented on the left. And you can see that it was a street without sidewalks, but people did walk and bike in the roadway along with drivers. In the master plan, Grove Street is designated as a neighborhood greenway, and this project is a pilot project, meaning that we're testing out treatments. Nothing permanent is being done. The first stage of the pilot was implemented in the late summer of 2021, and it's been in place for about 6 to 8 months now. So what is a neighborhood greenway? A neighborhood greenway is a street that is designed to give walking and biking priority and to reduce vehicle speed and volume. Tools that we can use to create neighborhood greenways include things like signs, pavement markings, speed countermeasures, volume management measures that discourage cut-through trips, and help to create safe and convenient crossings of arterial streets for both bicyclists and pedestrians. So that's kind of the idea behind a neighborhood greenway. This slide just shows some general examples of what different kinds of treatments can include for a neighborhood greenway. These are from the NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials guide, and just give some examples. Since this is a pilot project, I just want to be clear that we're not proposing permanent changes to Grove Street. This is a pilot project that allows us to test out things in consultation with you, the community, to see how things are working. These are semi-permanent treatments. They can be removed, modified, relocated, adjusted as necessary, and we are collecting speed and volume data at every stage in the process so we can see how the different treatments are affecting traffic, speed, volume on Grove Street. And we're also looking at the adjacent streets, not just Grove Street. This schedule shows kind of the overall timeline that's compressed into a one slide format. This project got started way back in January of 2020 in the before times. I know it seems like a lifetime ago, a world that maybe even possibly seems incomprehensible these days, going back that far in time. But we had a community meeting back in January of 2020. In February of 2020, we collected baseline data up to see what the current levels of traffic, speed, and volume were on Grove Street and the surrounding streets. And then a pandemic happened, which we were not expecting. So we took a little time to regroup and understand how this was going to impact our experiment and what needed to happen. In the meantime, MCDOT created a countywide program called the Shared Streets Program. It was not just a Grove Street program, it was a countywide program, but it was a situation where in residential streets like Grove Street, we would close the street to through traffic to allow pedestrians and bicycles to have more space, since people were trying to get out and walk and get outside, and also distance themselves from other people. So that shared street element was not part of the original program design, but we did use that to take advantage of collecting data. So we had the shared street program, we collected some data for that. And then we implemented stage one after having 2 community meetings where we also conducted a survey. We installed the stage 1 treatments, which were focused on speed countermeasures in the summer and fall of 2021. And then in March of 2022, this about 2 months ago, we collected data during the stage 1 pilot to understand how the stage 1 pilot had impacted speed and volume. And now you see where we are now. We're having a community meeting prior to stage 2. Now, this is in the initial concept. We're going to talk about whether this is still the direction that we want to go. But the initial concept was that we would keep the speed treatments and add diversionary treatments as part of stage 2, and then have those in place for several months, collect more data, and then have an end of project meeting where we talk about what the data shows versus stage 1 and stage 2, and where to go from there. So that's kind of what the overall view of the project is. And let's talk about what we saw from stage 1. So in preparation for tonight's meeting, we did conduct an online survey to gauge your preferences. And this is what we heard from you. Now, I want to point out that as of Monday, we'd received 110 responses to the survey. But the survey is still open, and it's going to remain open through May 27th. So if you have not had a chance yet to complete the survey, I would strongly encourage you to do so. When we had the survey back in 2020 for getting ready for the stage 1 treatments, we had about 300 responses. So we got about a third of those so far. So I know that there's people out there who responded to the first survey who have not responded to the second survey. So if you're one of those people, please take a few minutes to fill out the survey. It's 15 questions. It should take you about 10 minutes to complete. And if your neighbors or friends aren't aware of it, if you haven't seen it posted to your neighborhood listserv, if you don't mind posting it to your listserv, the more people who take the survey, the better our results are. So we would love to get feedback from a broad range of people. So please take that survey if you haven't done so already. But this is what we've seen so far from the survey. This pie chart looks very similar to the pie chart from the last round. We see that about 9% of the respondents live on Grove Street itself. About 40% live not on Grove, but within 1 block of Grove. and about 45% live within 5 blocks of Grove, but outside that 1 block radius. So this is these first 3 categories basically correspond to the neighborhood, and that's the vast majority, 93%. And then there's about 7% of people who don't live in the neighborhood, but who clearly do care about Grove Street because they bothered to respond to the survey. If we look at this slide, this top chart shows the concerns about Grove Street during stage 1. That's the current survey. But this bottom chart is is a chart from our previous presentation from our previous survey, which was taken in the summer of 2020 when the shared street was in place before stage 1 had gone into place. The top concern back then, by a long shot, was no sidewalk / no place to walk. We also had speeding, running stop signs, too many cars. Those are kind of concerns that were up there, but they paled in comparison to the no sidewalk grouping here. Now, we did rephrase the question a little bit in the new survey, but what you can see is that no sidewalk, no place to walk has dropped to the number 2 concern, and it's not nearly as lopsided as it was previously. And that's probably because we now have a walking space on Grove Street. Running stop signs is the top concern. Speeding is still up there. Cut through traffic up there. So that's kind of what we've heard so far. But again, the survey numbers could change because it's still open, and we would encourage you to take it. This is a new question compared to the last survey. We asked how stage 1 has changed the way you use Grove Street. The green slices here indicate people are doing something more. Yellow is about the same. Dark red is less than before, and the gray is not applicable, which probably means the person didn't do it before, it doesn't do it now. So in terms of walking on Grove, about half of your respondents say that they walk on Grove Street more than they used to. This is a pretty good chunk of people, about another 40% or so say they walk about the same. A few people walk less than they did before, and then there's a small slice here also that were people who probably didn't walk before or after. But this is good. This is a good indicator that the treatments are working well because we have increased walking, and that's one of the goals of the neighborhood Greenway. In terms of biking, a pretty big chunk here, about 45% or so, people responded not applicable, which means they probably did not bike on Grove before or now. But there is a pretty sizable chunk here, about 15–18% of people who say they bike more on Grove than they used to. So this is also a good indicator that the project is working as intended. Now, in terms of driving on Grove, about 2/3, maybe a little less than 2/3, say that they are driving on Grove about the same as they used to. But here's a pretty big chunk here, maybe about a quarter, of people who say that they drive on Grove Street less than before. Again, this is a good indicator because we're trying to discourage trips on Grove by car, that the project is working as intended. So these are self-reported, but the people who responded to the survey, these are good indicators that the project is working as intended. We also asked for preferences about the different treatments. Now, I want to point out that all of the treatments that are above this gap here, the top half of the chart, are treatments that are in place now. We also asked you about all of these treatments, including the ones below the gap in the previous survey. The ones above the gap are speed countermeasures. The ones below the gap are volume countermeasures. And before we did the survey, before we did stage 1 in the previous survey, all of the treatments that are above this gap here, all of the speed countermeasures were above 50% support. So we have seen some of these have dropped down. The mini roundabout being a pretty noticeable decline here. It's only about 43% in favor. And this may be because there is now a mini roundabout on Grove Street. This may indicate that you're not very happy about the mini roundabout. But all of these were above 50% before. Clearly, the big winner here is high visibility crosswalks, about 93% in favor, only about 2% opposed to high visibility crosswalks. So everyone seems to like this one for the most part. If we look down here, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but at the volume countermeasures, which would make it harder or impossible to drive the entire length of Grove Street, these are all underwater. They're all less than 50% support. In fact, most of them have at least 60% opposed. And so that's something that's important to note. So stage 1 has been in place since the late summer of 2021. Other than the speed humps, we had some logistical problems due to the pandemic in getting the speed humps delivered, but those were installed in the fall. Everything else was installed in the late summer, and you can see some pictures here of the treatments. We do have the mini roundabout here. You can see the walking lane here. We also have a painted bump out, high visibility crosswalk shown in this bottom image here. This just kind of shows what stage 1 looks like. We collected speed and volume data back in February of 2020 before the pandemic. Of course, we didn't know there was about to be a pandemic, but luckily we collected that baseline data before the pandemic happened. We measured things like 85th percentile speed, top speed, the average daily traffic. We also are collecting the same data at every step. So we have the February 2020 baseline. We collected again in September of 2020 during the shared street, and again in March of 2022 during stage 1, so about 2 months ago. So what did we see? If we look at the 85th percentile speed, this is the speed at which 85% of drivers and below are driving. So 15% of drivers are going faster than this. This is the sort of corollary to that. The baseline data from February 2020 is shown in green, and the stage 1 data is shown in blue from March of 2022. What we can see is that on average, during stage 1, the 85th percentile speed is 1.7% higher than the baseline data. So something has actually caused traffic speeds to go up a little bit on Grove. This could just be noise. It's not a huge amount, but traffic speeds are actually a little bit higher now than they were before the pandemic. However, if we look back to the shared street period, when we had a soft closure where we put up signs that said local traffic only, speeds actually dropped compared to the baseline by 19%. So compared to having the closures, we had a 19% decrease. With the shared treatment, with the stage 1 treatments in place, we have a 1.7% increase. So quite a difference. If we look at weekends, the numbers are very similar. So I'm not going to belabor this, but 1.8% increase on average. During the shared street period, we had a 21% drop compared to the baseline. And you can see those numbers here. Now I want to point out in both of these charts, the 85th percentile speed is below the posted speed limit. So even though that 85th percentile speed has gone up a little bit, it's still below the posted speed limits. People are still driving below 25 miles an hour most of the time. And if we look at this, this chart, this shows the percentage of people who are going above the posted speed limit, above 25 miles per hour. So in yellow, you can see the baseline data. In blue, you can see the stage 1 data, which was just collected 2 months ago. And we do see an increase. So back in 2020, northbound about 3% going above 25 miles an hour, southbound between 5 and 8% going above 25 miles an hour. And we see here northbound, especially in the section north of Thayer, 13.6% going above the speed limit. So I'm not sure what's driving that, but that's kind of the outlier there that's showing a pretty significant increase in the percentage of people who are driving above the speed limit. But again, 85% of drivers are going below the speed limit. And I will point out that this is between 25 and 31. I don't think we had anyone over 31 miles an hour. So it's not a lot of speeding, but it is speeding a little bit above the speed limit. Similar on weekends, so I don't think we need to belabor that. Now let's look at volumes. That's the number of vehicles driving on Grove Street. So if we look at the before here, February 2020, that's in orange. The after, the current stage 1 counts are in blue. What we can see is if we compare northbound to southbound, both before and after, you see that northbound has about twice as many cars as southbound. There are a couple of reasons for this, which we talked about at the last meeting, but basically, northbound used more of a cut through from Fenton Street than southbound is for a couple of reasons, one of which being that Cedar Street is one-way northbound leaving the neighborhood up toward Wayne Avenue. But we see that relationship pretty much stayed the same. The volumes are lower now, but they're still about twice as high northbound versus southbound. During the stage 1 treatments, we see that on weekdays, traffic volumes are down by about 39%. If we compare to the shared street when we had a soft closure where we said through traffic only, local traffic only, no through traffic, we saw a drop of 86%. Now, because we had a pandemic that affected globally affected volumes, it's important to think about having a control location. So our control location is on Sligo Avenue. During stage 1, so right now, Sligo Avenue has had an 8% decrease. So everything being equal, we would expect, if we hadn't done anything to Grove Street, we would expect Grove Street to have about an 8% drop, and we've seen a 39% drop. So that's a pretty significant indicator that we have decreased traffic more than the background. In terms of the shared street period, Sligo Avenue had a 23% decrease, and we saw an 86% decrease on Grove Street. So again, we think that in both of these indicators, we are seeing that these treatments do have an impact above the sort of normal rate of expectation. Weekend, again, very similar. We see that during stage 1, volumes are down 52%. They were down 87% when we had the street closed, except to local traffic. So we've seen how stage 1 has impacted Grove Street. What about the other streets in the neighborhood? That's an important question. So this chart, I know this is complex, and I would encourage you, we are going to post this PowerPoint to our website probably tomorrow, so I would encourage you to go back and take a look at this in depth. But basically, if you see a green teardrop, this means that the traffic volume has decreased, and the number inside indicates the percentage of the decrease. If you see a red teardrop, it means that the traffic volume has increased by the percentage amount that you see. So for the most part, we see decreases throughout the corridor. Again, 7% is kind of the baseline. So anything that's a greater decrease than 7% is sort of more than the background that we would expect based on our control location. There are a couple of places where we see some increases, and I think that we can kind of explain some of these reasons. On Bonifant Street here, for example, going westbound between Grove and Fenton, we've seen a 20% increase. And I suspect that some of that is because of people who decide not to turn left into Grove, but instead to stay on Bonifant and go over to Fenton Street, perhaps because they don't want to use Grove with the shared street treatments. So that could be one reason, or part of the reason for explaining the increase in westbound traffic on Bonifant Street. We also see increases on Houston Street. These increases are not as severe as the increases that we saw when Grove Street was closed to through traffic, but they are greater than the baseline we collected back in February of 2020. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about Houston Street in just a minute. We also see an increase of 10% on Thayer Avenue, and this is probably likely due to people who are coming down Thayer, and instead of turning left into Grove, they're turning left into Houston instead. So this is probably why we're seeing this 10% increase on Thayer Avenue. Not sure about Silver Spring Avenue since there's not a cut through here, but it could just be people who are continuing beyond Grove and finding a different route through the neighborhood, causing this increase here. So we have seen some increases, but by and large, we see decreases across the neighborhood. And actually, even though we're seeing percentage increases, if we look at the total volume, we have good evidence to show that the total volume is less. So comparing Houston and Grove, the count location is Grove and Houston between Thayer and Easley. That's our count location. So again, if we look at northbound and southbound, northbound always has about twice as many vehicles as southbound. So what we can see is that the first point here on the left is the before counts from February of 2020. And then the second data point is the shared street when Grove Street was closed to through traffic. And then the third data point on the right here is March of 2022 during stage 1. And what we see here is that when we closed Grove to through traffic, the number of cars on Grove dropped very precipitously. It went way down. This is like a 80% drop in southbound. I think it's a little bit more than 80% on northbound. And what we saw is that Houston Street did see an increase, but the increase on Houston Street was much less than the decrease on Grove. So some of the traffic that was using Grove shifted to Houston, but most of the traffic that was using Grove disappeared from the neighborhood altogether. So closing Grove Street did have an impact. Now, what about stage 1, where we reopened Grove Street to through traffic, but we made it narrower and required you to go slow through using these speed treatments? What we see is that traffic did increase compared to when it was closed, but it is still less than it was during the pandemic. And again, anything more than about a 7% decrease is more than the background. So that's our control location. So stage 1 is effective at reducing volume. And in terms of Houston Street, traffic is less than it was when Grove Street was closed, but it is still higher than it was during the baseline. So Houston Street still has seen an increase and may indicate that we should consider some treatments on Houston Street to compensate for the shift of traffic from Grove to Houston. But again, that shift is still less than the decrease in Grove, and also shows that traffic is not going, some of traffic is bypassing the neighborhood altogether. So let's talk about next steps. As I mentioned earlier, as originally conceived, we intended the pilot to be broken up into 2 stages, with stage 1 focusing on speed management and the pedestrian space, and stage 2 looking to add volume treatments. And just to kind of go through and make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of volume treatments, I have some pictures. One of the treatments would be a soft restriction. So examples of soft restrictions are basically meaning there's a sign that says you can't do something, but there's not a physical impediment to doing it. So examples include the shared street, when we just said we had signs that said road closed to through traffic. Another example could be a time-based restriction like the one on the left here, where there's a sign that says do not enter 7 to 9:30 a.m. and 4 to 7 p.m. Except Monday through Friday, right? So this was the sign. You know, you can drive past this sign. You risk getting a ticket, but there's nothing to physically stop you from driving past the sign. That's a soft restriction. We also have physical barriers. There's a couple different kinds here. We could do a closure like at the entry to the block. The street's still mostly two-way, but at the entry you can only leave, you can't enter. We could also put a median that runs down the middle of one of the east-west streets that would require everyone to turn right on Grove Street. They could turn right from Grove Street, and you could turn right onto Grove Street, but you can't go through on Grove, and you can't turn left into Grove. There would still be openings for bikes and pedestrians in that median. That's one option. And then we could do a full closure somewhere at one end of one of the blocks to sort of create a dead end on one block of Grove Street so that you can't go through the entire length of the street. Those are some. I'm just talking about some options. And here's some pictures of those similar examples. This leftmost picture here is from College Park. The center picture is from Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And this rightmost picture here is an example of a closure in Los Angeles, but there are other examples of this around the country. This is just one good picture that I have. And of course, we don't have to paint it with nice polka dots, but that could be an option potentially if it's closed. These are just some examples of what diversionary treatment could look like. Another example would be to make Grove Street one way, either in part or in whole. So we could say one block is one way. We could say the whole street's one way. If we really want to cause diversion, the one-way direction would need to be southbound, since most traffic is northbound. So a southbound one-way restriction would be more effective. But of course, the downside of this is that you as a local resident would also be impacted. You couldn't disobey this restriction and go down here as well. And so that could impact people's commutes, forcing you to take longer routes or more congested routes. So this, you've seen this chart before. I just kind of zoomed in on the important part, which is the diversionary treatments. What we can see here is that all of these are underwater. There's not amongst the survey. And again, the survey is still open, so these numbers could change. I wouldn't expect them to change significantly, but they could change a little bit depending on who takes the survey. About 60% opposed to all of these. The most acceptable one appears to be a closure. The least acceptable is the median diverter. But generally speaking, not a lot of support for the diversionary treatments. And we don't want to force something on the neighborhood that you're not okay with. We also asked you, is there a need for stage 2? So we asked you about your feelings about stage 1. About 49% of you said stage 1 is sufficient on its own. 14% of you said that stage 1 is not enough. You'd like to see more done. 13% of you said that Grove Street was better before we did anything, and you want to see it go back to the way it was before either stage 1 or the shared street. 1% chose not to answer, and 23% said something else. So there's a whole list. We do have those, but there's a whole list of comments in there. And then we also asked you, do you favor adding volume management or diversionary treatments as part of stage 2? 31% of you said that you did favor those. 18% were not sure. 51%, so just over half, said that you do not favor adding volume management treatments to stage 2. We also asked you about the walking lane. The walking lane is very popular. We have about 85% of people agreed with the statement, I like the walking lane. About 9% said that they disagree with that statement. So it's really hard to get 85% of people to agree on anything. So this is a pretty good indicator that you like the walking space. So this is a good thing to know that you're in favor of this. However, we do need to get some more information from you about the walking space, because the interim treatments that we've installed out there are not intended to be permanent or long-term. We do have some maintenance challenges. Those of you who live on Grove Street, who walk on Grove Street, may have noticed that we did lose some of the barriers due to snowplows, and it is hard to replace them because they have to be custom ordered. And so it is a challenge to replace them and get them reinstalled. So if we want to make this a permanent addition to Grove Street, we have basically 4 options that I'm going to run through. One option could be that we remove the walking lane and return Grove Street to the way it was before, where it was just a shared space. Drivers, bicyclists, pedestrians, all on the roadway. That's one option that would eliminate our maintenance challenges. Another option would be that we keep the walking lane, but we use permanent materials. So instead of using the recycled rubber barriers, we use concrete barriers of some kind. Another option is that we narrow Grove Street and we build a raised sidewalk, a traditional sidewalk, in the space that is currently occupied by the walking lane. So this would be, pretty low impact to property, but it would narrow the street sort of permanently as opposed to this temporary narrowing of it. And then the last option would be that we build a sidewalk behind the existing curb. This would require us to buy right-of-way. It would require us to probably relocate some of the telephone poles, and it would also probably require us to impact some of the retaining walls and landscaping along Grove Street. So this would probably be the most expensive and most disruptive option, but it would be one option. It would allow us to keep Grove Street at its former width instead of having it narrowed, and also provide a dedicated pedestrian space. So we asked you about these, and the three options that maintain some kind of walking space all got around 60% of the of people saying they were in favor of them. We didn't ask you to necessarily pick your favorite. We just said, are you in favor or are you opposed to? So the one that got the most strongest in favor is the one that includes building a sidewalk behind the curb, which is probably the most expensive and most disruptive option. But in terms of the overall level of favor, they're about the same. In terms of removing the walking lane and putting the street back the way it was with no walking space, that has about 70%, a little over 70% opposed to it. So that option is clearly unpopular. And I suspect that we will find some way to maintain some kind of walking space on Grove, but we don't yet know which way we're going to go with that. Any decision will definitely be vetted with the community. We also don't have any funding right now for any permanent improvements in terms of the walking lane, but there is potentially the opportunity to add some capital funding for that right now. So we are looking into what the future of this holds, and we should know more in the near future. But again, there will be more community involvement before we make any kind of decisions about that. So what are our next steps? Based on the comments that we get from this meeting and also through the survey, which is still open, by the way, we will determine what the best course of action is for stage 2, both for modifying stage 1 or installing stage 2 or figuring out what the permanent solution for the walking lane is. We are going to have more community engagement before we make any final decisions. So this is why it's important, if you haven't taken the survey, to go ahead and take the survey. So I really encourage that. I know I'm harping on that, but I want you to go take the survey. So I really appreciate you taking a few more minutes of your day to do that. So with that, we are going to get to the public comment section of the meeting. I do want to ask everyone to please be respectful of the other attendees and give others a chance to speak by keeping your comments concise. We have plenty of time for comments, but we do want to make sure that everyone has a chance to speak. So please do that. You are going to need to request to unmute yourself by raising your hand. I'll run through how to do that in just a minute in case you're not familiar. But if you've dialed in by telephone, you raise your hand by dialing *9, and then you have to dial *6 once we allow you to unmute yourself. If you don't feel comfortable asking your question verbally or making your comment verbally, you can type it into the chat box and send that to Dave Merrihew, and he'll read it on your behalf. So that's one option you have. Anything that is related to Grove Street is fair game. So we certainly are happy to get those comments. But we do have some, if you can focus on some specific areas of some specific elements, it would be really helpful to us. So for example, how do you feel about the stage 1 treatments? How are they working? You don't have to focus on all of these, by the way, but if you choose to, this would be helpful for us. Do you think the stage 1 treatments are working well? Do you think there are things that we should change about them? Do you think, do you favor adding volume management treatments, or do you think we shouldn't add volume management treatments? And what are your preferences for a permanent walking space? And then anything else you think that we need to know. We do really appreciate all the comments, all the feedback that I hope that you'll be giving us soon. Looks like we do have one hand up, so we'll get to that hand in just a minute. I just want to remind everyone to show you how to raise your hand. So it may vary based on your version of Zoom, but you may see it under participants or you may see it under reactions, but there should be a way that you can click raise hand. That is how you indicate that you would like to speak, and we will call on you. Again, once we call on you, we will ask you for permission to unmute yourself. We cannot unmute yourself without your consent, so you will have to click accept or agree once we ask to unmute yourself. And again, if you want to ask by chat, you can click the chat window and then select Dave Merrihew and then drop down to type your question by chat. So comments, please submit those in writing by May 27th. That's a week and a half from now. Email is the preferred way to do that. You can email me at matt.johnson@montgomerycountymd.gov. You can also mail them, although it's not preferred, but you can mail them by postal service to my name, Montgomery County DOT, Transportation Engineering, 100 Edison Park Drive, 4th floor Southeast, Gaithersburg, Maryland, 20878. That is on your screen. Again, the survey will remain open until May 27th. So with that, I appreciate everyone. I'm going to go ahead and appreciate everyone's comment in advance, but I'll also appreciate them again at the end. So right now I only have one hand up, but if you want to speak, please, now's the time to raise your hand and we'll get to you. Before I call on Mark, who's the only person with his hand up, I'm just going to ask Dave if we got any questions in the chat during the presentation.
We have not received any questions yet, Matt, from the public yet. So I'll keep the chat monitored.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to call on Mark. I'm asking you to unmute yourself, Mark.
Thank you very much. You're shaking your head, so I assume you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. My name is Mark Pastor. I live on Hankins Street, which runs between Houston and Grove Street, the north end. And first, I want to thank you for giving all the opportunity for input and for giving so much thought to 4 blocks of street. This is really great. And I was originally very skeptical of all of this. And I think what we've done so far has been a big improvement and made Grove Street a lot safer for folks. So that's good. One of the concerns I would like to speak against phase 2 reducing traffic, the measures to reduce traffic on Grove. One, as someone who lives close to Houston and walks down there with all the time, there is definitely an increase in traffic. And not only is there a significant increase in traffic, there's an increase in speed of traffic. And there are no sidewalks, no good options to get out of the way of traffic, except walking in the grass, sometimes in the rain, snow, whatever. It's right at the edge of the park where a lot of kids come to play soccer. And a lot of kids are in that street. So I would really urge you, hope that nothing is done that increases traffic on Houston Street. That would be a problem in itself, and that would be my fear if we do anything more to reduce traffic, to squeeze traffic on Grove. But thank you for listening to all of this. Thank you for what you've done so far. I don't have any thoughts on what's the best way to do the walking part of Grove, but it's clearly a good thing that a lot of people like. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. All right, our next up, we have Noam Unger. I'm going to ask for you to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I wasn't actually planning necessarily to speak, but I just wanted to follow on what Mark said because I could not agree more and want to emphasize exactly the same point that he was making. I live on Houston Street, 1 block off of Grove. I am actually currently driving in a car with multiple of my kids some of those kids who are in that street who are playing around in the park and on Houston constantly, as they're saying, multiple teenagers. And they wanted me to jump in and say that we absolutely support the point that Mark was making because there is more traffic and there's more traffic going faster on Houston Street as a result of what's happening. I also agree with Mark's point that overall things are also perhaps better with regard to Grove because I use Grove to get to and from lots of places, and I think it's important. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you for that comment. Next up, we have Gray Kimbrough. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Hi. So I live on Grove Street, and I first want to just comment, consistent with the feedback you've been getting, it's been a massive improvement. And so I walk my daughter to school on Grove Street most days. She bikes to school quite often, and both of those have just gotten so much better. It's been a massive improvement. I'd also like to comment that I tweeted a picture of my daughter riding bike, approaching the roundabout going south back to our house, and a county council or a city council candidate from another state sent me a message saying, can I use your picture in a campaign ad? It's an example of something we could have here. And I want to really underscore that this is an example of something we could have here, and we could probably have all over the county. We just need a lot more of it. And one example, as people have highlighted, is that we need more treatments like this on Houston Street. And not just in our part of downtown Silver Spring. We need these all over the county. And so I'd really like to emphasize that it's been a massive improvement, but we need a lot more of this. Also, there are a lot of gaps in the protection. And so as we talk about having a more permanent way to protect the pedestrians, I think I'd really like to hear more about how you're going to examine all those existing gaps and how we close a lot of those gaps. Another thing that really needs to be done here is connecting this to the crossing of Sligo. Right now it ends just short of that, and that crossing is still a huge mess. And so it's a major pain point for pedestrians and bikers when they get to the end of this, that crossing is not very safe at all. I also note that in many of the draft materials, there was more of a treatment on the section between Sligo and Silver Spring Avenue, and there's not any of that now. And we have seen some increase in speeding on this stretch as people just fly down that hill. And I'd also like to, one observation of maybe why people are speeding going up the hill towards Bonifant is that I've noticed people kind of gunning it to get to that, the one-way section, the narrow section. They see an opening, they feel like they can see straight ahead, so they gun it. While my daughter and I are walking, in the walking lane next to them. So I have noticed that may be kind of the behavior that's driving a bit of the escalation and speeding on that stretch. But one thing you may also want to do when you're presenting that data is to talk about the absolute number of speeders, for example. And with traffic down so much, even with a slight increase in speeders, we may actually be seeing a decrease in absolute number. One more thing about the roundabout, another potential treatment we could have at that intersection. People have commented on having a lot of trouble with the roundabout. I'm not sure really what that is, but I'd like to hear more about that. But an alternative treatment might be to have raised crosswalks at all sides of that intersection as a way of really signaling the importance of slowing down and stopping and looking for pedestrians. That may be an alternative to the roundabout that would allow us, and you could maybe do that with temporary measures, I'm not really sure, that would allow us to have a better longer term measure there. But those are, and then the final thing that I'd like to say is that I would agree with the comments that I'd like to avoid making parts of this one way. I'd like to instead see more focus on really nailing down the protection for walkers and slowing traffic down without trying to get into these games of making parts one way or blocking off parts of the streets or just making things really complicated. And then we do have to worry more about where the traffic goes into neighboring streets. I think that if we can really focus on making sure that people get these signals that they need to be driving slower and get the signal that it's safe to be walking and biking on the street, those things are really what I would like to see more focus on instead of this focus on trying to block off parts of the street. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Gray. Those are all great points, and I think that certainly things that we can consider for either stage 2 or for the permanent implementation of these treatments, whatever ends up sticking around. So I appreciate that. And David Schneider is up next. I'm asking you to unmute yourself.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Thanks again for this presentation. I have a question about the future of the walking lane. So I'm part of the majority that wants to keep the walking lane in some shape or form. You mentioned that there's no money in the capital budget right now for one of the options. And I'm wondering, like, how sustainable is the current walking lane? You mentioned that parts of it are deteriorating. So will there be efforts to sort of maintain it or patch it up until there's a more permanent solution, or what's the sort of short-term prospects for that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We are committed to maintain the walking lane through the length of this pilot, which is probably, it kind of depends on what direction we go with stage 2 or not, but there is actually, I mean, we don't know what the budget's going to look like until the council adopts the budget. But there is a proposal, I believe, in the council's version of the budget to add some money for the Grove Street. It's not just Grove Street, it's actually a longer neighborhood agreement that stretches all the way from Wayne and Cedar down to Fenton and Philadelphia and Burlington. So it's part of Cedar, part of Bonifant, part of Grove, and then part of Woodbury. So that capital improvement project might give us some ability to make these treatments permanent, were it to be included in the budget, but it's too early to say whether or not that's going to pass. And there may be other sources of capital improvement that we could tap as well. But this is a pilot, and the whole goal of this was to learn things. One of the things that we learned was that this rubber barrier does not hold up well to snowplows. So the how long this barrier is going to last is going to depend on how much snow we get. So, you know, we went a good, I think, 3 winters with like no measurable snow, and then we put this thing in and had snow this year, which is of course the way I kind of expected things to go. That's Murphy's Law for you. We go 3 years with no snow plowing, and then the season we install this, we have a whole bunch of snow events. So it really depends on how much snow we get. This product was actually designed for roundabouts, and so generally speaking, when you install it in a roundabout, it get the outer edge gets hit by a snowplow, but it's backstopped by other pieces behind it, and it had never been used in a linear fashion like this. And so the manufacturer was also monitoring this to determine maybe if there are improvements they can make to the product to make it more durable in a situation like this. But we learned some things, and I think we'll continue to observe this and see how it goes. But yeah, I definitely think that if we're going to leave this out for any measurable period of time, we're going to need to use more durable materials, or at a minimum order some additional reserve pieces, so that because it is going to happen again when they get ripped up by snowplows, that we can easily replace them at the end of the winter. Next up is Cindy Buddington. I'm asking you to unmute yourself, Cindy.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
I was wondering, how wide is the walking lane?
The walking lane is about 5.5 to 6 feet wide, which is as wide as we could make it, and still be on speaking terms with the fire department. That was the challenge was still being able to get a fire truck down the street if someone was not parked against the curb. So that was kind of the balance we had to strike. And so it's between 5.5 and 6 feet wide.
Okay, that's good. That's nice. That's wide. And the other thing is, I noticed that the bumpers between the walking lane and the street traffic lane, they're cement. And I was wondering, how far apart are they to each other? I mean, if a person was in a wheelchair, or somebody, you know, was pushing a stroller, or, you know, some type of device, and they wanted to cut across the street to the other side, is it wide enough? Is that gap wide enough? Is that like 4 feet wide, or?
So we have 2 different kinds of barriers that we use at intersections where there's no parking on either side of the street. We have concrete parking stops, and the reason we can use concrete parking stops in these areas is because since parking is restricted on the opposite side of the street, there's definitely enough width for a fire truck. In areas where parking is permitted on the east side of the street, there is enough theoretical room for a fire truck. But the reason we had to use the low profile barrier instead of the concrete curb stop was because the fire department was concerned that someone might not be parked against the curb. So even there's enough theoretical room, if someone's maybe like has a U-Haul parked there, or they're not parked right against the curb, but there might not actually be enough space. So we had to have something that was mountable by a fire truck. So that's, just to be clear, there's 2 different kinds. There's the regular 6-inch high concrete parking stops, and there's a recycled rubber 2.5-inch beveled low profile barrier for most of the length of the street. It's not designed for people to be able to pass through the barrier in those locations, because it's essentially a sidewalk. That's the intent, is that it's a sidewalk. And so if you were on a regular sidewalk, there would be a vertical curb. You wouldn't be able to just, if you were in a wheelchair, you wouldn't be able to just cross leave the sidewalk wherever, you'd have to find a place where there was a driveway apron or a curb ramp. So it's intended to be crossed at locations at the intersections, essentially. There are lots of driveway cuts on Grove Street on the west side. So wherever there's a driveway, there's a gap in the barrier. So even though it's not really designed to be transited by people in wheelchairs, like to leave the walking lane mid-block, there are plenty of locations where that is possible because of the driveways. And so I don't have a good number for you, but there are several locations on each block where it's possible. And you muted yourself, so you can't unmute yourself, but I'm going to ask if you want to unmute yourself again if you want to have any follow-up. And yeah,
There we
did you have any
go.
follow-up?
Yeah, no, not yet. Well, my phone rang, so I muted so it wouldn't disturb you
Well, I
or
appreciate
anyone
it.
else in the group. So, because I noticed that people who they park their car or are walking on the sidewalk and they want to just cross over to the other side, you know, they step over whatever's in their way. But you know, a person in a wheelchair or somebody's pushing a stroller, it's more difficult to do that. Now, obviously, you know, I'll use this as, I guess the furthest you would have to do is be able to go to a driveway and then cross over.
Correct.
You know.
And there's a balance between openings in the barrier, and I think Gray was mentioning this in his comments. There's a balance between having gaps in the barrier for openings and also being able to keep drivers out of the walking lane, because that's a real problem we have. Is that, you know, drivers, I like to joke, I have 2 cats. Luckily, none of them have walked across the screen today, although I can't rule that happening out. But drivers are like cats. If they fit, they sit. And so if we have a big opening in the walking lane, there's a good chance that a car will pull in there and just park there, and then you don't have a walking lane anymore. So there's kind of a balancing act, and I understand that we don't always agree on where the balance should be. But that's kind of the purpose of these meetings, is to figure out, you know, are we striking the right balance, or do we need to make adjustments? So those are great points, Cindy, and I appreciate you making them.
Right. Okay. No, I appreciate the information. So something I had really thought about. But thank you. I think you guys have done a nice job from what I see.
All right. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Cindy. Yep. All right. Next up, we have Mike English. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, Mike.
Hey, thank you, and thank you for the presentation.
Yep.
Yeah, I want to mainly talk about the pedestrian stuff. So I live actually just outside the immediate area. I'm in South Silver Spring, but I'm basically like 3 blocks away, cross Burlington, go over Burlington and Fenton, and I'm like right there. And I actually pretty fairly frequently walk through the area, like walking to a friend's place tomorrow, for example. And, you know, before the Grove Street walkway, like it was just kind of stick on Sligo or stick on Georgia for as long as possible, and then like find a place to cut over. This really has made it feel like more of a neighborhood, more inviting. You know, go to the trucks down on Thursdays that they have further down. I certainly support keeping the treatments. As far as the specific one, I mean, I'm a pretty firm believer in like the one that is feasible to get built is probably the best one. Like in a perfect world, probably taking up the same amount of space with a more permanent sidewalk is best. It keeps it thinner, disincentivizes traffic a little bit more. But yeah, I'd also encourage the department to just study as much as possible doing this with more roads, because I mean, it really has, you know, that block, it takes, you know, it's another alternative to Fenton Street. It really, I think, changes and makes the entire area more welcoming. And to the degree that it's feasible to expand this in the medium term, then I think that's good.
Thank you so much, Mike. Those are great comments. I appreciate them. We are out of people with their hands up, but if you have a comment or a question, you can please raise your hand now. While I give you a chance to think about that, I'm going to ask Dave if we got any more chats for comments or questions that were typed in.
So I've got a comment from Luke Jones that said that he agrees with Gray Kimbrough's comments regarding the additional speed treatments to Houston Street. And then I've got a comment here from Ariel Beerbaum that says, cars get a lot of speed coming off of Sligo Ave and it's a hill. I'd like to see the walking lane extended, even though there is a sidewalk, an additional speed bump on the portion of the street between Sligo and the end of the new townhomes. In stage 2, I'd like to see more permanent interventions for the walking lane. Cars and delivery vehicles get impatient waiting to pass each other, and they pull over into the temporary barriers into the walking lane often.
Is that it, Dave?
That was it. I don't have any other comment. Oh wait, someone else just commented. Well, you can. Do you want to answer that first, and then I'll read you the next one.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and I know we've gotten comments from Ariel in the past and at previous meetings, so I appreciate you staying involved. I think that stage 2 could be an opportunity for us to maybe look into. We weren't intending for stage 2 to be when we implement permanent treatments, but if we're deciding that the volume management treatments maybe are not the way to go, then maybe we could use some of the funding for stage 2 to start working on permanent installations. Again, there will be a community engagement process before then. But yeah, I understand the concerns with people coming down the hill on Sligo. The mini roundabout at Silver Spring was intended to kind of resolve some of those issues, but it may not be working as well as intended. And so clearly we can look more into that. I know I didn't specifically respond to this, but I know Gray, I think it was Gray, mentioned the crossing of Sligo, and maybe it wasn't Gray, so I apologize if I'm mixing up who said that, but I think the crossing at Sligo is also something we could look at in the future as part of a permanent intervention. I also did get a couple of chats to my chat. I know I mentioned that I wasn't monitoring it during the presentation, but I have had a chance to look at it now, so I can read through those as well. But we do have one more hand up, so I'm going to call on Gray again. We don't have any other hands up, so if you have any other comments and you haven't spoken yet, or if you have spoken and you want to speak again, now's the time to put your hand up. So I'm going to ask Gray to unmute himself.
Ian, yes, I did mention the Sligo crossing, as well as I had also talked about another speed treatment on the section by the townhouses near Sligo. And I wanted to ask the question about, or bring up the issue of snow. So you talked about how the snowplows popped a couple of the pieces off. So obviously that's one issue with snow. Another issue is that a lot of the adjacent homeowners didn't appear to believe that they had any responsibility to clear the walking lane. And so I shoveled it multiple times. I once most of the length, which was fun. But it wasn't getting cleared otherwise. And so I don't know if there's education that needs to happen. I think in general, there probably is some education that needs to happen about how we actually should treat them. But that is one example where we might need to be clear about that. Another thing that I had mentioned thinking about education is that, and I haven't noticed this as much recently, but earlier in the treatment, many drivers appeared to be confused about where bikes should be. And it might make sense to have a sign like on either end that kind of mentions that the bikes are, I mean, obviously we have the sharrows, but it might make sense to have some sort of signage that also mentions that the bikes are generally supposed to be not in the walking lane, but in the street. So I don't know if any others have noticed that, but my daughter and I were honked at by someone who was very angry once, and it was a little off-putting. And I just think that was kind of confusion about what's going on here. Right?
Yeah, those are great points. I would say that related to the snow comment, and it also kind of touches on the bike location as well, is that under Maryland law, the way a sidewalk is defined is that it's that portion of a roadway that is designated for walking. And so this would technically, under Maryland law, qualify as a sidewalk. And in Montgomery County, if your house is adjacent to a sidewalk, you are responsible for clearing that sidewalk within, I believe it's 48 hours of a snowfall. It might be 24 hours. But yes, homeowners should be clearing the walking lane. This is not an isolated issue. This is I think we have problems with this throughout the county of people who don't shovel their sidewalks. And I do appreciate you saying that you helped clear the length of it. That's going above and beyond, Gray, and I appreciate that. Shows some real dedication and some real care for your neighborhood. So thank you for that. I believe, did at least on one occasion send some county highway services crew down to clear it after some complaints. One of the things that we had hoped would work well, and maybe it did not work well. Again, this is a test case, right? It's a pilot, so we're learning things from it. Was that because it's not as high as a sidewalk, that if the street was brined, so if a truck went down to pre-treat the roadway, that the brine spray would also spray into the walking lane, and it would help prevent the snow from sticking to the road as much as it would on the sidewalk, for example. So that may not be the case. It may not have actually prevented the snow from sticking so well. So it's definitely something that we've learned. And mentioning where bikes belong, it is intended that bikes bike in the roadway. That's why we have sharrows out there. For everyone's reference, a sharrow is also known as a shared lane marking. It's the little stencil of a bicycle with 2 chevrons on top of it that indicate the direction. That's a sharrow, a shared lane marking. But because Montgomery County does not ban bikes on sidewalks, it is okay for you to bike in the walking lane, but that is not really where it's intended for you to bike, because it's not really wide enough for people walking and biking at the same time. But again, you are allowed to bike on the sidewalk in Montgomery County, except in the city of Gaithersburg. And so you would be allowed to bike in the walking lane, since it's technically is a sidewalk, even though it's not really a sidewalk in the way that we think of it, but legally it is a sidewalk. So those are great comments. Thank you for that. We also have Christopher Meyer, who's raised his hand. So I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to also echo that point about the walkway. It does look like a bike lane. I bike on Grove, and the first few times I did it, I had to look and think twice because I thought I was supposed to be in the sidewalk. But then I finally came to the sharrow and saw that I should be in the main roadway. So just appearances wise, when you're evaluating treatments, maybe considering making it look like a sidewalk, where maybe there's more consideration that the bikes, should preferably not go on the sidewalk if there's a better option. And then the other comment that I want to make was about the accessibility. Someone was mentioning, strollers and wheelchairs and the like, and maybe that stems from the fact that the sidewalk is only on one side of the road. I realize there's probably not the width to put it on both sides of the road, but I just want to put that out there that, like, in an ideal world, it would be a lot easier to traverse that with walkways on both sides of the road. I will put I put this in the survey, but I wanted to echo this. I actually went on Grove Street with a class of first graders, so like 20 first graders on Grove Street one day. So that was an adventure that probably would not have been possible without this addition. So this was a field trip to Coiner Farms. So again, like, thanks for making this happen. And yeah, just more of it everywhere. Just, more walkways, more bikeways. It's all great. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Those are great points. Yeah, we did consider potentially putting a treatment down that would make the walking lane a different color. If you've been to New York, you may have seen like in Times Square, where they've closed off Broadway, they use this kind of like taupe color surface to mark areas that are intended for pedestrian space. The problem is that this is intended to be an interim pilot, so that if it didn't work, we could rip it out and return the road to the way it was, and that would be very hard to remove. And so that's why we didn't do that. But were this to be a permanent walking lane, where we put in concrete barriers and it's permanent, we could potentially do some kind of different treatments with the asphalt. It doesn't have the same color, and that might help to distinguish it from essentially a bikeable space. We could also potentially look at, maybe, as Gray mentioned, signage, or maybe some other treatments that might make it a little bit clearer that bikes are intended to be in the road space. All right. We don't have any hands up. We still have plenty of time for comment. Actually, Christopher has raised his hand again, so I'm going to assume you have a follow-up. So I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with that because you raised a good point. You talk about painting it taupe, and one of my big criticisms of some of these treatments is that every treatment is like its own situation. You get different colors, different treatments and stuff, so it makes things very confusing, right? Because if you talk about painting it, now it really looks like a bike lane because you guys painted the bike lane green on Spring Street. So just caution, like I would just encourage you to think like, all right, what is going to make something really across the board, across the county, across your purview, make this obviously intended for pedestrians and something obviously intended for bikes and something obviously intended for cars, because people are stupid, and if it's not just plainly obvious, people are going to get confused and then bad things happen. So like right now that default is sidewalks where there's a raised curb. So I think that's what I was saying, is that like if you have a raised curb, it looks like a sidewalk. Everybody can identify it as an obvious sidewalk. So just when you said painted surface, my alarm bells were going off about Spring Street, which is itself very confusing because of novel treatments that are not used elsewhere.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Christopher. So yeah, in terms of consistency, you're right. We would definitely want to strive for consistency. Part of the issue is that we have to get off the shelf things. This is a pilot project. And so, you know, if we were doing things permanent, we have a little more flexibility, but since we're trying to do an interim treatment that's removable, we have to buy what's available off the shelf. And so that's one reason that things are not entirely consistent, and we can certainly move toward more consistency in the future. So those are great points. So let's see. I had a couple comments chatted to me, so I'm just going to go through those real quick. Rebecca Dearden, I think it is, says, for those of us on Grove who face Grove, we have very small front yards, and a sidewalk behind the curb would be incredibly intrusive. Essentially, pedestrians would be walking only a few feet from our front doors. So that's a good point, and that, you know, building the sidewalk behind the curb would be, I think, fairly disruptive because we would have to reconstruct some retaining walls in some areas, and there's not a lot of space in some cases. So that's one of the reasons why I think that's probably the most expensive option, the most disruptive option, but certainly something that we're not going to discount it right now, count it out right now, but something that would definitely be considered. And again, any decision that we make would be made in consultation with the community and after a public engagement process. So you would have plenty of time to give input. Also, Jane says, would you consider putting up a yellow-black warning strip in front of the storm sewer, or some sort of grate that would prevent people from slipping into the inlet? There's two in the 8200 block which are dangerous. So we can look into that. That's a good concern. That's a great example of the sorts of things that we want to hear about. So if you know specific issues that you think are causing problems, letting us know about that gives us an opportunity to examine those. So we can certainly take a look at whether we can get some reflective tape out there or something to make it a little more visible. That's a great point. Thank you. All right, with that,
I got a couple comments here. So one from Kelly Dorden. I walk my children to school along Grove Street every day. I think it's a huge and welcome improvement. I think expanding to include improvements to the Sligo crossing would increase Grove Street connectivity and accessibility to the rest of the area. I also agree with previous comments to consider treatments on Houston to increase pedestrian safety there. I still see a lot of cars blow through the stop signs heading east or west on Thayer and have wondered about raised crosswalks. Are there any possibilities for reflectors or other ways to increase visibility of the yellow bumper sections at night? We walk home from school at dusk and in fall and winter, and cars have driven into the lane to pass other vehicles while they were in the lane. So more visibility and a more permanent barrier would feel more protected.
Yeah, those are great points. And I know someone else brought up the idea of a raised intersection, and I didn't address that in my response. In the past, raised intersections has not been something that the Montgomery County DOT does, but we are more open to them now. And in fact, we are looking at them in some other projects. So I think that that's definitely something that could be considered as part of the permanent solution. Probably not something we could do with an interim treatment, just given the level of customization needed, because intersections are all a little bit different, and so getting standard size parts will be probably pretty difficult. But as part of a permanent installation, I think we could definitely consider that. So that's a great point. In terms of reflectors, I think that's also a great idea. And if we're going to keep the temporary barriers out there for a while, we probably could get some raised pavement markers and glue them on, and that would probably be fairly effective, although we might have to replace them every winter once we have some snow plows. Of course, the snow plows might be just as likely to rip up the barriers as rip off the raised pavement markers. So we'll see. Snow plows are very violent to road infrastructure, I have to say. I mean, I know we need them, but but they do a lot of damage to stuff that I try and install. Anything else, Dave?
I got one other comment here from Tim Haverland. Can you talk about how the completion of the work and repaving of Fenton Street may or may not have reduced traffic volumes on Grove?
Yeah, that's another great point, Tim. Thank you for that. There was, just for everyone's reference, in case you weren't familiar, although if you live in the neighborhood, I'm sure you were familiar, that Pepco had dug up Fenton Street for several years as part of their power line underground project. And that work was still ongoing in February of 2020 when we did our before counts, but it was completed, I think, during the time when we had the shared street open is when it was completed. So that also could have had impacts on traffic on Grove. It's really hard to do an experiment in the real world when you can't control all the factors. It's hard to say how much of an impact it had. I think one of the things to consider is that with traffic, there's sort of a critical volume at which point, adding one car is what it takes to sort of tip the balance from non-congestion into congestion. And so, with COVID, we said, well, during the height of the pandemic, traffic volumes were down like 25 or 30%. So you could definitely see why like a drop in 25 or 30% might mean there's not any congestion on Fenton Street to bypass. But what about 7%? Well, even 7% might be enough if Fenton Street's close to the tipping point. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. It's really going to be impossible to say whether or not that's a confounding variable. But I would say that given the volume reduction that we saw, we're talking like 40% reduction. I think that that's probably clear enough that at least some of that is independent of the fact that Fenton Street has been resurfaced and is no longer a Pepco construction site. But how much of that, I don't think we'll ever know. So, but that's a great point, and I wish we could have had a better. And I wish we had a pandemic to throw a wrench into things. There's a lot of things that made this this pilot and this experiment a lot more confounding than it might have otherwise been. So,
and I just got one more message from Jane G. That says, I like the flexibility with the yellow strips so that large trucks, UPS, could go through an area and move aside where there are parked cars. And then, frankly, I really liked phase one where people could walk in the middle of the road in the summertime.
Yeah, so just to be clear, she's referring to the shared street. Stage one's what's out there right now. I know that's confusing because technically the shared street was not part of this project. It was an independent project that we took advantage of to collect data for, but that's the shared street. The whole point of having the low profile barrier was because we knew we were going to have larger vehicles, and the alternative was to make the walking lane narrower, to make the walking lane like 4 feet wide or something. And we really thought that was too narrow. If we were to build a raised sidewalk or build a sidewalk behind the curb, or even a permanent walking lane that's still at road elevation, it'll give us some more flexibility to do things that might make it work well. But we do know there are going to be deliveries, there are going to be large vehicles, and we do need to accommodate those. And so that will be part of the discussions with whatever design we decide to move forward with. All right, with that, I don't think we have any more comments. So we still have time in the meeting, but we don't have to use it all. We can let you guys get back to your wonderful evening, but this is the last chance. If you do have a comment you haven't made, you want to raise that hand or send a chat to me or Dave. Give you like another minute to do that. So while I'm saying thank you to everyone who has participated tonight and throughout the process, this is your chance to raise that hand. Oh, we have one more. Oh, there's a claps. Not a hand. So,
I got a message here from another one from Kimbrough. Has there been any review of the curb cut between 8028 Grove and 8112 Grove? It's my understanding that MCDOT has not committed to completing the alley in this public right-of-way, in which case the county could close off the curb cut and extend the walking lane there. Alternatively, this public right-of-way could be used to build a pedestrian and bike connection between Grove and Fenton.
We haven't had any discussion of that because we haven't gotten into the details of building a permanent connection. And just for everyone's reference, and I believe I'm understanding, this is the alley that's between, it's parallel to Sligo Avenue, that's between Sligo Avenue and Silver Spring Avenue, north of the art space. I believe that's the one that's being referenced. And we haven't gotten into that discussion, but that's certainly something we can consider when we do the permanent sidewalk design. And I also got one more chat to me as well. So I'll go ahead and read that. James says, I missed the beginning of the presentation. Is there a consideration of making the mini roundabout permanent? The small radius confuses drivers and requires trucks to make multi-point turns or jump the curb. As a resident on the corner of Silver Spring and Grove, I must ask, is there a less utilitarian solution than a cluster of 4 traffic signs in the middle of the intersection? Yeah, James, so we didn't specifically talk about the mini roundabout, but that it's clear from the survey, at least so far, that support for the mini roundabout has dropped from when it was a concept to when it's actually been installed. So the whole point of this is that everything is removable. Nothing is permanent. I think we knew that mini roundabout was going to be a pretty tight radius. The goal there was to try and encourage people to stop at the 4-way stop, or at least slow down, preferably stop, but at a minimum slow them down. I think the suggestion of doing like a raised intersection might be a more effective treatment here. But that's not something we can do as an interim treatment. It's something that would have to be permanent treatment. So if the mini roundabout's truly a problem, I hope people will send an email and let me know about that, because that's something we could consider removing as part of stage 2, and seeing if not having it there actually works better than having it there. But yeah, we know that there's some difficulty. I know that some people go around it the wrong way. And they're not supposed to do that, but hopefully they're at least doing it slowly if they are going the wrong way. So, and I have, at least when it was first installed, I definitely saw 1 or 2 drivers going around it the wrong way, but I think that that probably some of that has gone away. There's always a learning curve with new infrastructure. People have to get used to it. So with that, I will start saying thank you, since I haven't gotten any more chats or seen any more hands, but I really do appreciate everyone who's been involved in this project, whether it's from the beginning or just tonight. But it's really helpful because we couldn't do these projects without you. We really could not have projects that worked with the neighborhood if we didn't know how the neighborhood felt. So I really do appreciate everyone who has come out and given comment, either verbally or in writing. And I really do appreciate all of your time. I think it's still a beautiful evening. There's still time for you to go out and enjoy that the nice late spring breeze. So I appreciate you spending a little bit more time inside than you might otherwise have done tonight, but we really do appreciate it. The survey is still open. The link is in the email that you got with the login information. There's a link to the survey in there, and also in the several emails that I sent to the email list. So please take some time to take the survey if you haven't done it. If you have any thoughts that you want to put in writing, please email those to me by May 27th. That's not this Friday, but the next Friday. And I really hope that everyone has a great evening and a great rest of your week. And I will say just a reminder for those of you who are interested that Bike to Work Day is this Friday. So a good opportunity, if you haven't, to try out biking to work or biking to the local pit stop and getting a t-shirt and enjoying the hopefully great weather. I know we sometimes have really rough weather, but I think it's supposed to be pretty nice for Bike to Work Day this year. So I appreciate everyone's time. Looks like we don't have any more hands, so I can stop vamping and let you all enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much. Have a great one. And this recording will be posted in a few days.